Get this kid out of my office before I have him arrested for wasting federal resources!
Get this kid out of my office before I have him arrested for wasting federal resources. Detective Raymond Kellerman's voice cut through the conference room like a blade. His 6'3" frame towered over the small figure seated at the massive oak table. Around them, 8 FBI agents stood with arms crossed, faces twisted in barely concealed contempt. Tobias Chen sat perfectly still, 12 years old, black, brilliant, and completely surrounded. His Roosevelt Middle School mathematics champion hoodie looked absurdly out of place among the dark suits and federal badges. His worn backpack rested on the polished table, next to a thick folder of documents that had taken him 6 months to compile. Agent Patricia Morrison circled the table like a shark scenting blood. She laughed, sharp and cruel. "This is what called an emergency meeting? A black kid playing Encyclopedia Brown?" The room exploded in mocking laughter. Phones appeared. Several agents started recording, clearly planning to share this moment later as entertainment. Tobias kept his hands folded on the table. His mother had taught him to stay calm when facing hatred, but his heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought everyone could hear it. "Sir, if you would just look at the documentation," Tobias began. "Documentation?" Kellerman snatched the folder from the table. He flipped through pages without reading them. "Let me guess, you watched CSI and thought you could solve real crimes, maybe saw something on YouTube?" Another agent leaned against the wall, grinning. "Where are your parents? Does your mother know you're here wasting our time? Or did you skip school to play detective?" The racist undertones weren't even subtle anymore. They dripped from every word like poison. Tobias took a breath. "I have evidence connecting Thomas Brennan, your chief of security, to the murder of Victoria Bennett 15 years ago. The HVAC permits show—" The room erupted. "Thomas Brennan?" Morrison's face flushed red. "You're accusing the FBI's chief of security? Based on what? Google searches and a child's imagination?" An agent in the back called out, "Did his mama help him with his little school project?" More laughter. Phones recording. The humiliation was being documented for their amusement. Kellerman slammed the folder on the table. Papers scattered. "You're an ignorant kid who doesn't understand how the real world works. Thomas Brennan is a decorated federal agent with 30 years of service. You're a 12-year-old with an internet connection. I have documentation proving—" "You have nothing." Kellerman's face was inches from Tobias's now. "You have theories pulled from crime shows and Wikipedia pages. Do you understand how serious it is to accuse a federal agent of murder?" Morrison moved closer, her voice dropping to something almost threatening. "Does your mother work? Multiple jobs, I'm guessing? Who's watching you after school? Is that why you have time to play detective?" The implication was clear. Poor black kid, single mother working too much, no supervision, making up stories for attention. Tobias felt tears burning behind his eyes, but refused to let them fall. He'd won the National Junior Forensics Award at age 10, published a research paper on pattern recognition at 12, earned a perfect score on every mathematics competition he'd ever entered. But none of that mattered here. They saw only his skin color and his age. "Sir, Victoria Bennett was murdered because she discovered pharmaceutical contamination at Vertex." "Enough!" Kellerman grabbed Tobias's folder and walked to the trash can. He held it over the opening, making direct eye contact. Then he dropped it. The folder hit the bottom of the trash with a hollow thump that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Go back to your neighborhood and leave police work to people who actually know what they're doing," Kellerman said. Each word was deliberate, designed to cut. "We don't need kids with wild theories disrupting real investigations." Morrison pulled out her phone. "I'm calling security. And possibly Child Protective Services. We need to have a conversation with this boy's mother about his mental state." The CPS threat hit harder than anything else. Tobias thought of his mother, Dr. Sarah Chen, working double shifts at Temple University Hospital, sacrificing everything to give him opportunities. Now these people wanted to weaponize social services against them. Security arrived. 2 officers in tactical gear, treating a 12-year-old like a threat. "Escort him out," Kellerman ordered. "And if he comes back, we file harassment charges. Make sure everyone on this floor knows about the kid who wasted federal time with his detective fantasies." Tobias stood slowly. He gathered his empty backpack with shaking hands. The walk to the door felt like miles. Every agent watched him pass. Some smirked. Others shook their heads in disgust. One muttered just loud enough for Tobias to hear, "Probably saw it on TikTok." More laughter followed him into the hallway. The security officers flanked him through the building. Other federal employees stopped to stare at the young black kid being escorted out. Their expressions said everything. Another problem from the wrong side of town. Another kid who didn't belong in spaces meant for serious people. Outside, the September sun felt too bright. Tobias walked down the steps of the FBI building on Arch Street, his throat tight, his eyes burning. 6 months of research, hundreds of hours in libraries and databases, evidence that could solve a 15-year-old murder. But what exactly did this 12-year-old black genius discover? What was Tobias Chen's discovery that would change everything? Let's roll back 3 weeks. The Roosevelt Middle School library smelled like old books and possibility. Tobias Chen sat in his usual corner, surrounded by towers of criminology textbooks that reached nearly to his shoulders. At 12 years old, he looked small behind the fortress of knowledge he'd built around himself. Mrs. Kowalski, the school librarian, had long since stopped questioning his reading choices. Most 7th graders checked out graphic novels or fantasy series. Tobias checked out forensic pathology textbooks, criminal psychology journals, and legal case studies meant for graduate students. "Still working on your project, Toby?" Mrs. Kowalski asked, setting a fresh stack of books beside him. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." She glanced at the titles. Advanced Pattern Recognition in Criminal Investigation, Forensic Timeline Analysis, The Science of Physical Evidence. "You know," she said gently, "you're the most brilliant student I've encountered in 23 years of library work. But sometimes I worry you're carrying weight that's too heavy for someone your age." Tobias looked up, his dark eyes intense behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Kowalski, someone murdered a woman named Victoria Bennett to hide the truth. She was trying to save lives. If I don't help find justice for her, who will?" The librarian's expression softened. She patted his shoulder and walked away, leaving him to his research. Tobias returned to the Philadelphia Inquirer archives displayed on his laptop screen. March 2009. Victoria Bennett, 28-year-old pharmaceutical researcher, found dead in her Center City apartment. No signs of forced entry, no murder weapon, no suspects. The case had gone cold within 6 months, but Tobias saw what others missed. His photographic memory had absorbed every news article, every police report available through public records, every detail about Victoria's life and work. His mind connected information the way other people breathed, naturally, constantly, seeing patterns invisible to everyone else. That ability had earned him recognition most adults never achieved. National Junior Forensics Award at age 10, when other kids were still learning long division. Gold medal at the Mathematics Olympiad at 11. Published research paper on pattern recognition in criminal investigations at 12. The youngest author in the journal's history. His teachers called him gifted. His classmates called him weird. The truth was more complicated. And in 3 weeks, Tobias would learn exactly how hard the world fought against young black voices speaking truth. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Running late again, baby. Can you walk to the hospital when you're done? Love you." Tobias typed back quickly. "Love you too, Mom. I'm fine. Working on something important." He returned to his screen, to Victoria Bennett's case, to the puzzle everyone else had abandoned. The library was quiet except for the clicking of his keyboard and the turning of pages. Outside, other kids his age were playing basketball, hanging out with friends, living normal 12-year-old lives. Tobias was hunting a killer, and he was closer than anyone knew. On his laptop screen, a document caught his attention. Something about building permits filed in the months before Victoria's death. Most investigators wouldn't have thought to check construction records, but Tobias wasn't most investigators. His finger paused over the trackpad. Then he clicked. And the pattern he'd been searching for suddenly became crystal clear. "Oh no," he whispered to the empty library. "They planned this months in advance." Mrs. Kowalski looked up from her desk, concerned by the tone in his voice, but Tobias was already pulling out his notebook, his hands moving faster than thought, documenting everything before the connection could slip away, because what he'd just discovered would either solve a 15-year-old murder or get him killed trying. Tobias's bedroom wall told a story nobody else could read. Red strings connected photographs to newspaper clippings. Blue strings linked professional relationships. Green marked timeline correlations. Black highlighted suspicious coincidences that seemed too perfect to be accidents. His mother called it obsession. Tobias called it pattern recognition. The web stretched across his entire wall, a massive puzzle that had consumed 6 months of his life. Victoria Bennett's photograph sat at the center, surrounded by circles of evidence that expanded outward like ripples in water. Corporate documents, property records, pharmaceutical research abstracts, news articles about contaminated medications, death certificates of patients who died from natural causes that weren't natural at all. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway at 3 a.m, watching her son add another piece to his collection. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from a 16-hour shift at the hospital. "Baby, you need sleep. You have the academic decathlon competition tomorrow." Tobias didn't look up from the document he was highlighting. "Mama, someone killed this woman to hide the truth? Sleep can wait." Sarah moved closer, studying the wall that had replaced her son's childhood posters of basketball players and superheroes. Now it was filled with evidence of corruption and murder. "What truth, Toby?" Victoria Bennett worked for Vertex Pharmaceuticals as a researcher. 3 months before she died, she discovered contamination in their main manufacturing facility. Tobias pointed to a cluster of red strings. The contamination was in medications prescribed to thousands of patients. Heart medications, blood pressure pills, insulin. Contaminated how? Heavy metals, industrial chemicals, things that shouldn't ever touch human medication. His finger traced along the timeline. Victoria documented everything. She was going to publish her research and report the company to federal regulators. Sarah's medical training made her understand the implications immediately. Those contaminated medications would have killed people. "They did kill people, Mama. Look." Tobias pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop. "I cross-referenced death certificates from patients who took Vertex medications during the contamination period. 47 people died of complications from their underlying conditions, but the timeline matches exactly when the contaminated batches were distributed." The numbers made Sarah's blood run cold. "Victoria was going to expose this," Tobias continued. "She was going to save lives by forcing a massive recall. The research would have bankrupted Vertex and sent executives to prison. So they killed her instead." "Yes, and made it look like an unsolved random crime." Tobias stepped back from his wall, seeing the full picture. "The police investigated for 6 months and found nothing because they were looking for a stranger, a burglar, a random act of violence. They never considered that a pharmaceutical company would murder their own researcher." Sarah put her hand on her son's shoulder. "Baby, I'm proud of you for caring about justice, but I'm also scared. These are powerful people with everything to lose, which is exactly why someone has to expose them. But why does it have to be you? You're 12 years old. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise." But they both knew that some promises were impossible to keep, not when you were hunting killers who'd already proven they had no problem making people disappear. The Philadelphia Free Library's main branch on Vine Street opened at 9 on Saturday mornings. Tobias was waiting at the doors at 8:45. His mother was working another double shift, exhausted but unable to turn down the overtime pay they desperately needed. She dropped him off with a packed lunch, $20 for emergencies, and strict instructions to text her every 2 hours. The library felt like a cathedral of knowledge. High ceilings, rows of books reaching toward skylights, the hushed atmosphere of serious learning. Tobias headed straight for the computers that held digitized city records. He'd spent weeks thinking about Victoria's murder from every angle. The killer needed access to her apartment building, needed to understand the layout, the security systems, the patterns of when residents came and went. How do you get that kind of detailed access without raising suspicion? The answer came to him at 2 a.m. Construction permits. If you had legitimate reason to be inside the building, working in mechanical spaces, studying blueprints, nobody would question your presence. You'd be invisible. Just another contractor doing repairs. Tobias logged into the city's permit database and entered Victoria's address, 1847 Chestnut Street, Center City. Then he set the date range, 6 months before her death. The results loaded. 17 permits filed for various work at that address. His eyes scanned through routine requests, electrical inspections, window replacements, plumbing repairs, then he froze. 6 weeks before Victoria Bennett's murder, someone had filed an emergency permit for HVAC system repairs throughout the building. The work was classified as urgent due to potential carbon monoxide risk. The company, Apex Mechanical Services. Tobias's heart raced as he opened the permit details. The work had taken 3 weeks to complete. The contractors would have had access to every apartment's ventilation system, including Victoria's. They would have understood exactly how air circulated through her unit, where the intake vents were located, how to introduce something into her apartment without ever picking a lock or breaking a window. His hands shook as he copied the permit number and company information. "You need help finding something, son?" Tobias looked up. A security guard stood behind him, arms crossed, expression suspicious. The man's eyes moved from Tobias's face to the government records on the screen. "I'm researching municipal construction permits for a project," Tobias said politely. "What kind of project?" "A school research paper on urban infrastructure management." The guard's skepticism was obvious. A black kid in the government records section researching permits and construction companies. It didn't fit his narrow view of what belonged where. "Doesn't the kids section have computers? Maybe you'd be more comfortable there." The implication was clear. This space wasn't for him. "I'm comfortable here, sir, but thank you for checking." The guard lingered, making his presence felt, making sure Tobias knew he was being watched. An elderly white woman working at a nearby computer looked up. "Oh, you must be one of Mrs. Kowalski's students. She mentioned a brilliant young researcher was coming in today." The lie was kind and perfectly timed. The security guard's expression shifted slightly. If a librarian vouched for the kid, maybe he wasn't causing trouble. "Well, let me know if you need anything," he muttered, walking away but glancing back twice. Tobias nodded to the woman who'd helped him. She smiled and returned to her work without another word. Sometimes allies appeared in unexpected moments. He turned back to his screen and started digging into Apex Mechanical Services. The company had filed for bankruptcy 3 months after Victoria's death, convenient timing. The owner, Gerald Hutchins, had died in a single-car accident in 2011. Another convenient coincidence. But companies don't just disappear. Someone takes over assets, settles debts, closes accounts. Tobias pulled up business dissolution records. Gerald Hutchins had a business partner who bought out his share of Apex Mechanical right before the bankruptcy filing. The buyout happened 2 weeks after Victoria Bennett's murder. The partner's name made Tobias's breath catch in his throat. Thomas Brennan. He clicked through to corporate registration documents. Thomas Brennan, listed as co-owner of Apex Mechanical Services from 2007 to 2009. Before that, his employment history showed 5 years as Director of Security for Vertex Pharmaceuticals, the same company Victoria Bennett was investigating, the same company that would have been destroyed by her research. Thomas Brennan had worked security for Vertex. He co-owned the construction company that got access to Victoria's building weeks before her death. Then he bought out his partner and dissolved the company right after she was murdered. The connections were undeniable. But when Tobias searched for Thomas Brennan's current employment, his hands started shaking so badly he could barely control the mouse. Thomas Brennan currently served as Chief of Security for the FBI's Philadelphia field office. The man who murdered Victoria Bennett had spent the last 13 years working for the very organization tasked with solving her murder. Protected by a federal badge, trusted with sensitive investigations, handling classified information about ongoing cases, and nobody had ever connected him to the victim. Tobias printed every document. He photographed every screen. His photographic memory absorbed details, but he needed hard copies, backup evidence that couldn't be deleted or denied. When he left the library 3 hours later, his backpack was heavy with proof that would either solve a 15-year-old murder or get him killed. Because now Tobias understood exactly who he was dealing with. Not just a killer, but a killer protected by the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. A killer who'd proven he could make problems disappear. And Tobias Chen, a 12-year-old black kid from a working-class neighborhood, was about to become his biggest problem yet. The question wasn't whether Tobias should report what he'd found. The question was whether anyone would believe him long enough to listen. Tobias sat on his bed that night, surrounded by printed documents that proved Thomas Brennan murdered Victoria Bennett. The evidence was perfect. The connections were undeniable. The timeline matched exactly, but none of that mattered, because Thomas Brennan wore an FBI badge, and Tobias Chen was a 12-year-old black kid from a neighborhood where police rarely bothered to solve crimes, let alone listen to witnesses. His mother found him at midnight, staring at his wall of evidence with tears running down his face. "Baby, what's wrong?" "I know who killed Victoria Bennett, I can prove it, but nobody's going to believe me." Dr. Chen sat beside him on the bed. "Tell me." Tobias explained everything. The HVAC permits, Apex Mechanical Services, Brennan's employment at Vertex Pharmaceuticals, his current position as FBI Chief of Security. When he finished, his mother's face had gone pale. "Toby, these are powerful white men. They won't just dismiss you. They'll destroy you for even suggesting this." "I know. They'll say you're making it up. They'll question your mental state. They'll come after me for not supervising you properly." Her voice cracked. "Baby, I've seen what happens when black families challenge the system. Child services gets involved. Jobs disappear. People who speak up end up losing everything." Tobias wiped his eyes. "So I should just stay quiet? Let a murderer walk free because I'm scared?" "I'm saying the game is designed for us to lose." "Then maybe it's time someone changed the game." The determination in his voice reminded Sarah of his father, the man who died standing up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. She pulled her son close. "If you do this, our lives will never be the same." "If I don't do this, I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror." They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, the soundtrack of their neighborhood, where justice was a luxury few could afford. "What do you need from me?" Sarah finally asked. "I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing, and I need you to be ready for them to fight back." "They will, baby. They absolutely will." Tobias looked at his wall of evidence one more time. 47 people dead from contaminated medication. Victoria Bennett murdered for trying to expose the truth. 15 years of a killer hiding behind a federal badge. "Mama, you always taught me that silence in the face of injustice makes you part of the problem." "Well, I refuse to be silent." Dr. Chen's eyes filled with tears of pride and terror. "Then we do this together. Whatever happens, we face it together." The next morning, Tobias called the FBI Philadelphia field office. His hands shook as he dialed. His voice cracked when the receptionist answered. "I have information about the Victoria Bennett murder case from 2009. I need to speak with whoever's investigating cold cases." The receptionist sounded bored. "Hold, please." Elevator music played for 3 minutes. Then a gruff voice came on the line. "Detective Kellerman, Cold Case Division. Who's this?" "My name is Tobias Chen. I'm calling about the Victoria Bennett murder. I have evidence connecting Thomas Brennan to her death." A long pause. Then Kellerman's tone shifted, half amused, half annoyed. "Thomas Brennan? Our chief of security?" "Yes, sir. I have documentation showing—" "How old are you, kid?" The question wasn't innocent. It was dismissive. The tone said everything. "Your age disqualifies your credibility." "I'm 12, but that doesn't change the evidence." Kellerman laughed, actually laughed. "You're 12 years old and you're calling to accuse a federal agent of murder. Did you get this theory from TikTok?" "Sir, if you would just look at the documentation, come to the office tomorrow at 10. Bring whatever you've got. This should be entertaining." The line went dead. Tobias sat holding the phone, knowing exactly what he'd just walked into. They weren't taking him seriously. They thought this was a joke, a child's fantasy, something to laugh about during lunch break. But he'd made the call. He'd set things in motion that couldn't be stopped. Tomorrow at 10, he would walk into the FBI building and try to convince racist, dismissive adults that a black child had solved a case they'd failed to crack for 15 years. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Absolutely everything.
Get this kid out of my office before I have him arrested for wasting federal resources!
The humiliating words continue to replay in Tobias's head. You have nothing. You have theories pulled from Wikipedia and crime shows. Do you understand how serious it is to accuse a federal agent of murder? I understand justice should matter regardless of... You're an ignorant kid who doesn't understand how the real world works. Thomas Brennan is a decorated federal agent. You're a 12-year-old with an internet connection and too much time on your hands. Go back to your neighborhood. Leave police work to people who actually know what they're doing, people who belong in these spaces. Tobias stood on the sidewalk outside the FBI building, trying to control his breathing. His chest felt tight, his eyes burned, his hands shook so badly he had to shove them in his pockets. 6 months of work dismissed in minutes, called ignorant, treated like trash. All because he was a black kid who dared to speak truth to power. He pulled out his phone to text his mother when something made him freeze. Across the street, a black SUV sat at the curb, engine running, windows tinted dark, but the driver's window was cracked open just enough. Tobias could see the man behind the wheel. 50s, silver hair, dark sunglasses despite the overcast September sky, watching the FBI entrance with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. As Tobias watched, the man raised a phone to his ear. The distance was too far to hear anything. But Tobias had taught himself to read lips during long hours of silent research in libraries, a skill he'd developed to understand conversations happening across rooms. The man's lips moved, 2 words that made Tobias's blood turn to ice. "The kid knows." The SUV pulled away from the curb smoothly, disappearing into Philadelphia traffic before Tobias could even think to photograph the license plate. But he'd seen the man's face clearly, and his photographic memory never forgot a face. Tobias pulled out his phone with trembling hands, opened the folder of research photos he'd saved, scrolled through images of Thomas Brennan from corporate events, FBI ceremonies, public appearances. There, same silver hair, same sharp features, same cold expression. The man in the SUV was Thomas Brennan. The FBI's chief of security had been parked outside his own building, watching to see who emerged after making accusations about Victoria Bennett's murder, and now he knew exactly who Tobias Chen was. The realization hit like cold water. Tobias wasn't just investigating a killer anymore. He was being hunted by one. His first instinct was to run. His second was to call the police. But what would he say? A federal agent watched me from across the street? They'd laugh harder than the agents in that conference room. Tobias started walking, then jogging, then running. 8 blocks to Temple University Hospital. His mother's shift wouldn't end for another 3 hours, but he needed to see her. Needed to tell her that everything had just become infinitely more dangerous. Because if Brennan knew who Tobias was, he could find where they lived, where his mother worked, every detail of their lives. Tobias had studied 15 years of cold case files. He knew what happened to people who threatened powerful criminals. They had accidents. Their houses caught fire. They disappeared on the way home from work. And when those people were black, when they lived in neighborhoods police didn't care much about, the investigations were minimal. Cases closed quickly. Justice never came. His lungs burned by the time he reached the hospital. He burst through the emergency room doors, backpack bouncing against his shoulders, looking for his mother's familiar face. She wasn't in the ER. She wasn't at the nurse's station. "Excuse me?" Tobias asked a nurse he recognized. "Where's Dr. Chen?" "Staff break room, honey." "But she's in a meeting." Tobias was already moving. He took the stairs 2 at a time to the 2nd floor, pushed through the door to the staff lounge, and stopped dead. His mother sat at the small table looking confused and worried. Standing beside her were 2 men in dark suits. Not hospital security, not doctors. They turned when Tobias entered. The taller one smiled. It was the coldest smile Tobias had ever seen. "Tobias Chen? We need to ask you some questions about the accusations you made this afternoon. Your mother has given us permission to speak with you." Dr. Chen looked at her son, her expression asking, "What accusations? What's happening?" "These agents said you went to the FBI building today without telling me," she said. "Toby, what's this about?" The shorter man stepped forward. "It's nothing serious, Dr. Chen. Just some follow-up questions about a cold case. Standard procedure when civilians provide tips. Won't take more than a few minutes." But something was wrong. Tobias's pattern recognition was screaming danger. The suits were expensive, but wrong somehow. The wrong cut, the wrong fabric for federal agents. Their shoes were too new. FBI agents walked miles through buildings every day. These shoes looked like they'd never touched city streets, and when the taller man shifted position, his jacket opened slightly. Tobias saw it clearly. A small pin on his lapel. Corporate logo he recognized from months of research. Vertex Pharmaceuticals. These weren't FBI agents investigating his tip. These were men connected to the very company Victoria Bennett had been trying to expose. The company that had murdered her to protect their profits. And they were standing in his mother's break room, smiling like concerned federal officers, while his mother looked on with growing confusion and fear. Tobias's mind raced through possibilities at lightning speed. If he revealed what he knew, they'd know their cover was blown. His mother would be in immediate danger. If he said nothing, they'd probe for information about his evidence. Try to determine how much threat he posed. Either way, this was the most dangerous moment of his life. Because the people who'd murdered Victoria Bennett 15 years ago were now standing 3 feet away from his mother, and Tobias was the only one who knew it. Tobias's survival depended on the next words out of his mouth, but he made his choice. He let his shoulders slump, put embarrassment on his face, made himself look like exactly what those FBI agents had called him, an ignorant kid who'd gotten in over his head. "Actually," Tobias said, forcing his voice to crack slightly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm really sorry for wasting everyone's time." The taller man's eyes narrowed. "A misunderstanding?" "Yeah." Tobias looked at his shoes. "I was doing research for a school project on unsolved crimes. My teacher, Mr. Harrison, said I could pick any historical case for my criminal justice elective. I guess I got way too into it and started bothering real investigators." Dr. Chen's expression shifted from confusion to that particular kind of maternal frustration every kid knew. "Tobias Chen, are you telling me you've been skipping after-school activities to play detective?" "I'm sorry, Mom. I just got really interested in the case and thought I'd found something, but the detectives at the FBI showed me how my research was all mixed up. I confused a bunch of dates and made connections that weren't really there. The performance had to be perfect. One wrong word and these men would know he was lying." The shorter man spoke, his voice carrying a hint of Boston accent. "What exactly did you tell the agents this afternoon?" "Just stuff I found on the internet about the Victoria Bennett case. I thought I'd discovered some connection between her pharmaceutical research and this old construction company. But honestly, I probably just watched too many crime documentaries. The detective was right. I was being stupid." "What construction company?" The question came fast. "I don't even remember the name now. Apex something? But the detective threw all my papers away, so I don't have any of it anymore. He said it was garbage conspiracy theory stuff." The taller man studied Tobias for a long moment. "You don't have any of your research left? Nothing saved on your computer at home?" This was the critical question. They needed to know if evidence existed somewhere they couldn't control. "No, sir. I had it all in one folder. The detective tossed it in the trash at the FBI building." Tobias made himself sound bitter and embarrassed. "Said I was wasting their time with internet theories, which I guess I was." The taller man's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Of course, Dr. Chen. We just want to make sure there's no confusion about sensitive matters. Thomas Brennan is a decorated federal agent with an impeccable record. False accusations, even from children, can be damaging. The explicit mention of Brennan's name was a warning, a threat disguised as information. They were telling Tobias exactly who he was dealing with and how protected that person was." "I understand," Tobias said quietly. "I won't be making any more accusations. I learned my lesson." The shorter man pulled out a business card and handed it to Dr. Chen. "If your son remembers anything else about his research, please call this number immediately. For his own safety, it's important that we know about any misunderstandings he might have created." The card had no name, just a phone number. The men left, their expensive shoes clicking on the hospital linoleum. The moment the door closed, Dr. Chen grabbed Tobias's shoulders. "What was that really about?" Tobias waited, counting to 30 in his head, making sure they were truly gone. Then he checked the hallway through the small window in the door. Empty. He turned to his mother, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. "Mom, those weren't FBI agents. They work for the company that killed Victoria Bennett, and they know I've been investigating." "What?" "The man outside the FBI building, Thomas Brennan. He saw me leave. He knows who I am now. Those men came here to figure out how much of a threat I am." Dr. Chen's face went pale. "Toby, we need to call the police right now." "Mom, Brennan is the police. He's the FBI chief of security. Who do we call? Who's going to believe us over him?" They stood in the break room, surrounded by the normal sounds of a hospital, overhead pages, distant monitors beeping, staff discussing patient care, but their world had just tilted into something dark and dangerous. "They threatened you," Dr. Chen said. "That card, that warning about safety. They were assessing if I'm a problem they need to eliminate. If I'd admitted I had evidence hidden somewhere, we'd both be dead by morning." His mother pulled him into a fierce hug. "We're going home right now. We're packing what we can carry and we're disappearing. I'll quit my job, we'll move to another state." "Running won't stop them, Mom. If they want to find us, they will." "Then what do we do?" Tobias pulled back, looking at his mother with determination that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "We finish what I started, but we do it smart. We do it in a way they can't stop." "How?" "I need to find Victoria's research. the actual contamination data she was going to publish. If we have proof of what they were covering up, proof of why they killed her, then we have insurance. Something so damaging they can't risk it going public. Dr. Chen was shaking. Her son was 12 years old and talking about insurance policies against murderers. Where would that research be? It disappeared 15 years ago. Nothing really disappears anymore, Mom. Everything leaves a trail. Victoria was careful. She had to be if she was going to expose pharmaceutical contamination. She would have backed up her research somewhere safe, somewhere they couldn't find it even after killing her. And you think you can find it? Tobias thought about his connection web, his months of research, his pattern recognition that saw things others missed. I think I'm the only one who can. They left the hospital together 20 minutes later, mother and son walking quickly through Philadelphia streets as evening shadows lengthened. Behind them, a black SUV pulled away from the curb, following at a distance, watching, waiting. They didn't go home that night. Dr. Chen drove them to a diner in South Philadelphia, far from their apartment, far from the hospital, far from anywhere they could be easily found. They sat in a corner booth while Tobias explained everything: the connection web, the HVAC permits, Brennan's career trajectory from Vertex security to FBI protection, the fake agents with their Vertex pins and their threats disguised as concern. By the time he finished, his mother's hands were shaking around her coffee cup. Baby, they killed Victoria Bennett to protect corporate profits. What do you think they'll do to us? The same thing if we let them. That's why we need to find her research. But where? If it's been hidden for 15 years, it's not hidden, Mom. It's just mislabeled. Tobias pulled out his phone, showing her screenshots he'd taken during library research. Victoria was smart. She knew what she was risking. She wouldn't have kept all her evidence in one place where it could be destroyed. Dr. Chen looked at the documents her son had compiled. Sometimes she forgot he was only 12. His mind worked at levels most adults never reached. What are you thinking? Victoria worked in pharmaceutical research. Her whole world was data, documentation, peer review. She would have backed up her contamination findings somewhere other researchers could access them. A research database? Exactly. Somewhere academic. Somewhere that requires credentials to upload but stores data permanently. Tobias's fingers flew across his phone screen. Universities maintain digital archives of research data. They're supposed to keep everything for decades, in case future scientists need to reference old studies. So you think Victoria uploaded her contamination research to a university database? I think she disguised it as something else. Made it look like preliminary data for an unrelated project. That way, even if Vertex came looking, they wouldn't recognize what they were seeing. Dr. Chen felt something shift inside her. Fear transformed into determination. These people had threatened her son, had come to her workplace with smiles and warnings, had murdered a woman trying to save lives. What do you need from me? Tobias looked surprised. Mom, you don't have to... What? Do? You? Need? The steel in her voice reminded Tobias that his mother hadn't survived foster care, medical school, and single parenthood by being weak. She was a fighter. Always had been. University research databases require academic credentials to access. Medical credentials would work. Your Temple University Hospital ID would get you into most pharmaceutical research archives. Tell me where to look. Over the next 3 days, they became partners in the most dangerous investigation of their lives. Dr. Chen used her hospital login to access pharmaceutical research databases from universities across the country. Tobias used his pattern recognition to identify search parameters that might reveal Victoria's hidden work. They worked in public libraries, coffee shops, anywhere with free Wi-Fi and lots of witnesses. Never the same location twice, always watching for black SUVs or men in expensive suits. Tobias had created a search algorithm based on Victoria's research interests, her publication history, and the timeline of the contamination discovery. He was looking for data uploaded in the 3 months before her death related to pharmaceutical manufacturing but disguised as something innocuous. On day 3, working from a Starbucks in University City, they found it, University of Pennsylvania's Digital Research Archive, a data set uploaded March 2009, 6 weeks before Victoria's murder. Listed as Preliminary HPLC Analysis Compound Degradation Studies. The file was attributed to V. Bennett, independent researcher. Tobias's hands shook as he clicked the download link. Spreadsheets loaded. Chemical analysis reports. photographs of contaminated drug samples, internal Vertex Pharmaceuticals communications discussing the contamination and debating whether to issue recalls. The evidence was devastating. Vertex executives had known about heavy metal contamination in their main manufacturing facility for 8 months before Victoria discovered it. They'd calculated that recalls would cost more than potential lawsuits from patients who got sick or died. So they'd kept distributing contaminated medications. Victoria's research documented everything: batch numbers, distribution dates, patient outcomes. She'd even tracked death certificates of people who'd taken the contaminated medications and died of complications. 47 deaths directly attributable to Vertex's knowing distribution of poison drugs. "My God," Dr. Chen whispered, reading over her son's shoulder. "They committed mass murder for profit." And Victoria was going to expose all of it. Tobias scrolled through pages of documentation. This would have destroyed the company, sent executives to prison, cost them billions in lawsuits and criminal penalties. So they killed her instead. They killed her and made it look random. Unsolved murder. No clear motive. Police investigated for 6 months and found nothing because they were looking for the wrong type of killer. Dr. Chen pulled her son close. "Baby, we have what we need. We can take this to the media, to the Department of Justice, to who, Mom?" Tobias turned to face her. "Brennan is FBI. He has connections throughout law enforcement. If we go to the wrong person, we disappear before the evidence ever becomes public. Then what do we do?" Tobias thought about the agents who'd laughed at him, who'd called him ignorant, who'd thrown his evidence in the trash because a black kid's voice didn't matter to them. We need someone inside the system, someone who cares more about solving Victoria's case than protecting their career. "You think that person exists?" "I think I might know who it is." His mother looked skeptical. "Who?" "Detective Raymond Kellerman." Dr. Chen's expression hardened. "The man who called you ignorant? Who humiliated you in front of 8 other agents? Who threw your evidence in the trash?" "Yes." "Baby, he's part of the problem, not the solution." "Maybe. Or maybe he's a good detective who made a terrible mistake." Tobias pulled up Kellerman's service record on his phone. "Look at this. Before the Bennett case, Kellerman was a rising star, youngest detective ever promoted to major crimes, solved 12 homicides in 3 years. His career was going places. So after Victoria's case went cold, everything stopped. No promotions, stuck in cold case division for 15 years, passed over for advancement again and again." Dr. Chen studied the records. The case ruined his career. Because he never gave up on it. Look, he's requested the Bennett file 14 times in the past 5 years, submitted evidence for retesting, re-interviewed witnesses on his own time. The case has haunted him for 15 years. That doesn't mean he'll help a black kid he already dismissed. No, but it means he cares about justice for Victoria. And maybe, just maybe, if I show him evidence he can't ignore, he'll choose truth over ego. His mother was quiet for a long moment. Outside the coffee shop window, Philadelphia moved through its normal rhythms. People living ordinary lives, unaware that a 12-year-old boy and his mother were planning to expose a conspiracy that had killed dozens. "It's dangerous," Dr. Chen finally said. "Everything about this is dangerous. If Kellerman turns on us, reports back to Brennan, then we'll already have backup plans in place, insurance policies, ways to get the evidence public even if we can't." Dr. Chen looked at her brilliant, determined son. "When did you get so brave?" "I learned from my mother. The woman who survived foster care, put herself through medical school, and raised a kid on her own while working 3 jobs. You taught me that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified." She pulled him into a fierce hug. "Then we do this together. But we do it smart. We protect ourselves first. Always." That night, Tobias drafted an email to Detective Raymond Kellerman's personal address, not his FBI account, his private email that Tobias had found through public records. The subject line read, "The ignorant kid has Victoria Bennett's research. Call me." His finger hovered over the send button. This was the moment, the choice that would determine everything. He clicked send, and hoped that somewhere beneath Kellerman's racist dismissal was a detective who still believed in justice. Detective Raymond Kellerman saw the email at 11 p.m. He was in his apartment in northeast Philadelphia, nursing his 3rd beer and reviewing cold case files he'd brought home from work. The Bennett case folders sat on his coffee table where they'd been sitting for 15 years. His phone dinged with a new message. The subject line made him sit up straight. The ignorant kid has Victoria Bennett's research. Call me. Kellerman opened the email. He was surprised. The kid had his personal email address. That took research skills most adults didn't have. He'd found Victoria's research. If that was true, if this wasn't just a kid's fantasy, it would be the breakthrough Kellerman had been searching for since 2009. And he'd accused Thomas Brennan, the FBI's chief of security. That accusation would either solve everything or destroy what was left of Kellerman's career. Kellerman looked at the Bennett case file on his table. Victoria's photograph stared back at him. 28 years old, brilliant researcher, trying to save lives, murdered and her case going cold because he hadn't been good enough to solve it. For 15 years, that failure had eaten at him. Every promotion he was passed over for, every younger detective who moved ahead while he stayed stuck, all because the Bennett case had become his white whale. He thought about yesterday, the conference room full of agents laughing at a black kid, his own words, ignorant kid playing with things you don't understand. The way he'd thrown the boy's evidence in the trash without even reading it. Because the kid was 12, because he was black, because Kellerman had been too arrogant and too bitter to consider that maybe, just maybe, someone smarter than him had seen what he'd missed. His phone sat on the table. The number was right there in the email, 12 hours to decide. Kellerman picked up his phone, then put it down, picked it up again. What if the kid was right? What if Victoria's research really existed? What if Brennan really was involved? But what if this was a trap? What if calling a 12-year-old witness without proper protocols got him fired? What if this destroyed what little career he had left? Kellerman looked at Victoria's photograph again, and he realized something that made his stomach turn. He was more worried about his career than justice for a murder victim, more concerned about his reputation than truth, more afraid of being wrong than of letting a killer walk free. When had he become that person? When had protecting himself become more important than protecting others? The Bennett case had broken something inside him, made him bitter, defensive, closed off to anything that challenged his assumptions. And yesterday, that brokenness had made him throw away evidence from a kid who might have actually solved the case. Kellerman picked up his phone. 3 a.m. was too late to call, but he could send a text. His thumbs moved across the screen. "This is Detective Kellerman. I'll meet you tomorrow. Tell me when and where." He hit send before he could change his mind. The response came back in less than a minute. "Tomorrow noon. Rittenhouse Square Park, fountain bench. Bring detectives you trust, but don't tell anyone from FBI. Brennan has people inside." Kellerman stared at that last line. If the kid was right about Brennan, if there really was corruption inside the FBI, then this meeting could go sideways in a dozen dangerous ways. But if the kid was right about Victoria's research, if this really was the breakthrough he'd been searching for, Kellerman looked at the case file one more time. Then he started making calls to 3 detectives he'd worked with for over a decade, people he trusted with his life, because tomorrow at noon he was either going to solve the case that had defined his career or make the biggest mistake of his life by trusting a 12-year-old kid he'd called ignorant. Tobias didn't sleep the night before the meeting. He spent hours preparing multiple copies of Victoria's research, flash drives hidden in different locations, cloud storage uploads to 5 different services, encrypted files sent to major newspapers with instructions to publish if he and his mother didn't check in every 6 hours. Dr. Chen watched her son work with a mixture of pride and terror. "Baby, what if something goes wrong? That's why we have backup plans." Tobias showed her the system he'd created. "If we don't send a cancellation code every 6 hours, the evidence automatically releases to the New York Times, Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, and CNN. Even if they silence us, the truth still comes out." "Dead man switches." Exactly. They both knew what that phrase really meant. Protection that only worked if you were already dead or disappeared.
The next day,
Dr. Chen's phone was configured to start live streaming to multiple social media platforms the moment she pressed a single button. Everything that happened in that park would be captured and broadcast before anyone could stop it. "We're making ourselves very hard to kill quietly," Tobias said. His mother flinched at the word kill coming from her 12-year-old's mouth. But they'd moved past pretending this wasn't life or death dangerous. They arrived at Rittenhouse Square Park at 11 a.m., 1 hour early to study the terrain, identify exits, position themselves strategically. The park was beautiful on this September morning. Trees providing shade, fountain creating peaceful white noise, families enjoying the last warm days before fall fully arrived, normal people living normal lives, unaware that in 1 hour their peaceful park would become the setting for exposing a 15-year-old murder conspiracy. Tobias sat on the bench near the fountain, backpack heavy with printed evidence and flash drives. His mother positioned herself 20 feet away, phone ready, looking like any other parent watching their child. At exactly noon, Detective Raymond Kellerman walked into the park. He wasn't alone. 3 other detectives flanked him. All white, all looking skeptical but curious. Men in their 40s and 50s who'd spent careers solving crimes that Tobias had lived his entire life during. Tobias stood as they approached, his heart hammered against his ribs. Kellerman stopped 3 feet away, studying him with different eyes than yesterday. Not dismissive anymore, cautious, measuring. "You're really here," Kellerman said. "Yes, sir. Thank you for coming. These are Detectives Morrison, Chen, and Rodriguez from Major Crimes. I trust them with my life." Kellerman gestured to his colleagues. "You said you have evidence." Tobias opened his backpack. "I have Victoria Bennett's contamination research showing Vertex Pharmaceuticals knowingly distributed poison medications that killed 47 people. I have documentation connecting Thomas Brennan to..." That's when the black SUVs appeared. 3 vehicles entering the park from different directions, moving with precision. Men in dark suits emerging before the vehicles fully stopped, and walking between them, FBI badge held high, was Thomas Brennan. The setup was brilliant, confident, the move of someone who believed themselves untouchable. "Everyone stay calm," Brennan called out, his voice carrying authority across the park. "I'm Special Agent Thomas Brennan, FBI Security Division. I need everyone to step back from the child." Families in the park stopped, pulled out phones, started recording. Kellerman's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. "What's the FBI doing here?" "We received intelligence that this individual," Brennan gestured toward Tobias, "has been making terroristic threats against federal agents and may be experiencing a psychological crisis. We're here to take him into protective custody for psychiatric evaluation." It was perfect cover. Confiscate the evidence. Discredit the witness as mentally unstable. Make everything disappear under the guise of protecting a troubled child. The other detectives looked uncertain. FBI outranked local police. Federal jurisdiction trumped city authority. If Brennan claimed this was a federal matter involving threats against agents, but Tobias had prepared for exactly this scenario. He raised his voice, making sure it carried to the gathering crowd, making sure every phone camera captured what came next. "Detective Kellerman, in my backpack is documentation proving that Thomas Brennan murdered Victoria Bennett 15 years ago to cover up pharmaceutical contamination. The evidence is uploaded to multiple secure locations. If anything happens to me or my mother, it automatically releases to every major news organization in the country." Brennan's confident expression cracked slightly. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The kid was supposed to be quietly taken away, evidence confiscated, problem solved, not publicly declaring conspiracy in front of dozens of witnesses with recording phones. "The boy is delusional," Brennan said, recovering quickly. "He needs psychiatric help, not..." "Then let's test that theory right here," Kellerman interrupted. He'd made a decision. Tobias could see it in the detective's eyes. 15 years of failure had just been given a chance at redemption, and Kellerman was choosing truth over institutional authority. "Kid, show me what you've got." Tobias pulled documents from his backpack with shaking hands. He held up the first page where everyone could see. "This is an emergency HVAC permit filed 6 weeks before Victoria Bennett's death. It gave workers access to every apartment in her building, including ventilation systems." He pulled out the next document. "This shows the permit was filed by Apex Mechanical Services, co-owned by Thomas Brennan." Next page. "This is Thomas Brennan's employment history showing he worked as Director of Security for Vertex Pharmaceuticals when Victoria was investigating them." The crowd was growing, more phones appearing, park visitors drawn by the confrontation unfolding. Brennan's men moved closer, trying to intimidate, but too many witnesses had gathered, too many cameras were recording. "This is classified federal evidence being handled improperly," Brennan said, his voice harder now, desperation creeping in. "Everyone needs to disperse." "Actually," came a new voice that cut through the tension like a blade, "I think everyone should stay exactly where they are." A woman in her 60s walked into the park, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals in full tactical gear. She held up federal credentials that made Brennan's face go white. Special Agent Jennifer Blackwood, FBI Internal Affairs Division, Washington, D.C. The world seemed to hold its breath. Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of federal authority, and suspicion of murder in connection with the death of Victoria Bennett. The moment froze like a photograph. Thomas Brennan standing in the center of Rittenhouse Square Park. Dozens of phones recording, news vans screeching to stops at the park entrance, U.S. Marshals moving in with handcuffs, and a 12-year-old black kid who just brought down a conspiracy 15 years in the making. "This is outrageous," Brennan said, but his voice had lost its authority. "I'm a decorated federal agent. You can't possibly—" "We can and we are." Agent Blackwood moved closer, marshals flanking her. "Yesterday morning, Dr. Sarah Chen contacted our Washington office with evidence suggesting systematic corruption in the Philadelphia FBI field office. While you were busy dispatching assets to intercept her son, my team was reviewing 15 years of covered-up murder investigation." Tobias felt his mother's hand on his shoulder. She'd made one more call he hadn't known about. Insurance beyond insurance. Blackwood continued, her voice carrying across the silent park. "We have Victoria Bennett's research showing Vertex Pharmaceuticals knowingly distributed contaminated medications. We have construction permits proving you accessed her building weeks before her death. We have financial records showing payments from Vertex to your shell companies, and we have testimony from your former business partner's widow about conversations regarding handling the researcher problem." Brennan's face had gone from white to gray. His men were backing away, suddenly unwilling to be associated with what was happening. "The boy is making things up." "The boy," Blackwood said coldly, "did in 6 months what your colleagues failed to do in 15 years. He solved Victoria Bennett's murder because he was smart enough to look where no one else thought to look, and young enough to believe truth actually matters." The crowd erupted in applause. Not everyone understood the details, but everyone understood the story. Powerful man brought down by determined kid. Detective Kellerman stood beside Tobias, weapon drawn, positioned between the boy and Brennan. His expression carried something Tobias hadn't seen before: respect. Brennan made one last desperate move. He lunged toward Tobias, hand reaching inside his jacket for something that made every cop in the park tense. But Kellerman was faster. The veteran detective stepped fully in front of Tobias, his service weapon aimed at Brennan's center mass, his voice carrying 15 years of frustration finally finding a target. Don't make this worse than it already is." U.S. Marshals tackled Brennan before he could reach whatever he was going for. The takedown was brutal and efficient, face pressed into grass, arms wrenched behind his back, handcuffs clicking with a sound that seemed to echo across the park. Cameras captured everything. The FBI chief of security, decorated federal agent, respected authority figure, being arrested in front of dozens of witnesses because a 12-year-old black kid had been smarter, braver, and more determined than any of them. As marshals hauled Brennan to his feet, Tobias felt something break loose inside his chest. The fear he'd carried for weeks, the weight of knowing people wanted him dead, the pressure of being dismissed and mocked and called ignorant. His mother pulled him close, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, baby. You actually did it." Around them, the park erupted in celebration. Families who'd been watching approached with congratulations. Someone started clapping. Others joined. The applause built until it felt like thunder. Detective Kellerman holstered his weapon and turned to Tobias. For a long moment, the two just looked at each other. The detective who'd thrown evidence in the trash. The kid who'd been called ignorant. "I owe you an apology," Kellerman said quietly. "More than an apology. I owe you everything. You solved this case. You brought Victoria justice. And I almost stopped you because I was too arrogant and too bitter to listen." "You listened eventually," Tobias said. "That's what matters." "No, what matters is that you didn't give up when I dismissed you. You kept fighting even when every adult told you that you were wrong. That kind of courage, that kind of brilliance." Kellerman's voice cracked. "I've been a detective for 23 years. You've been alive for 12, and you're already a better investigator than I'll ever be." Agent Blackwood approached, marshals escorting Brennan to a federal vehicle. "Mr. Chen, we're going to need you to provide formal testimony about your investigation. Your mother as well." "Yes, ma'am?" "And for what it's worth..." Blackwood looked at him with something like wonder. I've worked internal affairs for 18 years. I've investigated hundreds of cases of federal corruption. Never have I seen a civilian, let alone a child, conduct an investigation this thorough and this precise. You have a gift. The news vans had arrived in force now. Reporters pushing through crowds, trying to get interviews, cameras capturing the moment. A young black reporter managed to get close. Tobias Chen, can you tell us how you solved a case the FBI couldn't solve for 15 years? Tobias thought about the 6 months of research, the nights without sleep, the librarians who'd helped, the mother who'd risked everything to support him, the pattern recognition that let him see connections others missed. But mostly, he thought about Victoria Bennett, 28 years old, brilliant researcher trying to save lives, murdered because truth was inconvenient to powerful people. Victoria Bennett tried to expose pharmaceutical contamination that was killing people, Tobias said, his voice steady despite exhaustion. She was murdered to keep her silent. For 15 years, her case went unsolved because investigators were looking for the wrong kind of killer. They expected random violence. They got calculated corporate murder. How did a 12-year-old figure out what experienced detectives missed? Tobias glanced at Kellerman, who nodded permission to continue. Because I didn't have assumptions about what murder looks like. I didn't have biases about who could be a killer. I just followed the evidence wherever it led, and I refused to be silent when people told me my voice didn't matter. The reporter pressed, "People are calling this the most remarkable cold case solution in decades. What do you want people to know?" Tobias looked directly into the camera. Thought about all the other kids like him. Black children told they don't belong in certain spaces, young people whose voices get dismissed because of their age, anyone who's been called ignorant by people who should have known better. Truth doesn't care about your age or your race or whether powerful people believe you. It only cares about evidence and courage. If you've been dismissed, if you've been told you don't matter, if people have thrown your ideas away without listening, keep fighting, because sometimes the smallest voice is telling the biggest truth. His mother squeezed his shoulder, pride and relief making her sob openly. Detective Kellerman stood beside them, finally on the right side of justice. And across Rittenhouse Square Park, cameras captured the moment that would define a generation's understanding of what real courage looks like. A 12-year-old black kid who refused to be silent, a murder victim finally receiving justice, and a system forced to acknowledge that brilliance comes from the most unexpected places, if you're willing to listen. The video went viral in minutes. Tobias standing in Rittenhouse Square Park, backpack full of evidence, facing down FBI agents while declaring truth to dozens of cameras. Thomas Brennan being arrested. Detective Kellerman stepping between a killer and a child. The moment captured from 20 different angles by 20 different phones. By evening, it had 40 million views across platforms. By morning, it was international news. Boy Genius Solves 15-year FBI cold case dominated every headline. Network news ran special segments. Legal experts analyzed the evidence on cable channels. Social media exploded with people sharing their own stories of being dismissed by authority figures. The hashtags trended for weeks. Justice for Victoria. Listen to black voices. Your truth has no age. 3 days after Brennan's arrest, Detective Raymond Kellerman showed up at the Chen family's apartment. He looked different than he had in that FBI conference room. Smaller somehow, humbled. He held a folder in his hands and wouldn't quite meet Dr. Chen's eyes when she opened the door. "Detective Kellerman," she said coolly, the protective mother who hadn't forgotten how this man had treated her son. "Dr. Chen, I was hoping to speak with Tobias, if that's all right with you." She made him wait in the doorway for a long moment, let him feel uncomfortable, then stepped aside. Tobias sat at their small kitchen table doing homework like this was any normal Thursday afternoon, like he hadn't just exposed a federal conspiracy and become the most famous 12-year-old in America. Kellerman pulled out a chair. "Can I sit?" "Yes, sir." They sat in silence for a moment. Through the apartment window, Philadelphia moved through its evening rhythms. Normal life for everyone except the Chen family, whose world had been transformed completely. "I've been a detective for 23 years, Kellerman finally said. "Spent 15 of those years working the Bennett case. It consumed me, destroyed my career, made me bitter and defensive and—" He paused, struggling with words. "And racist. I need to say that word out loud because that's what it was." Tobias said nothing, just listened. "When you walked into that conference room, I saw a black kid in a hoodie. I made assumptions about your intelligence, your neighborhood, your life. I dismissed you before you opened your mouth because I'd convinced myself that I knew better than everyone, that if I couldn't solve the case, nobody could. Kellerman's voice cracked. I threw your evidence in the trash. 6 months of research that could have solved Victoria's murder. I threw it away without reading a single page because my ego was more important than justice. You listened eventually, Tobias said quietly. Not soon enough. You and your mother could have been killed because I was too arrogant to take you seriously the first time. Kellerman opened his folder. I want to show you something. He spread documents across the table. After Brennan's arrest, Internal Affairs reviewed every case he'd touched in 15 years. They found evidence tampering in 43 investigations, witness statements that disappeared, evidence that went missing from storage, cold cases that could have been solved but weren't because Brennan made sure they stayed cold. Tobias studied the files with his characteristic intensity. He was protecting other criminals, or protecting himself. We're still figuring out how deep his corruption went, but here's what I need you to understand. Kellerman met Tobias's eyes directly. You didn't just solve Victoria's murder. You exposed systematic corruption that's been destroying justice for over a decade. Because of you, we're reopening 43 cases. Because of you, families are finally getting answers. Dr. Chen stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, listening. The Philadelphia Police Department wants to create a civilian cold case consultation program, Kellerman continued. We're going to bring in people outside law enforcement, researchers, analysts, people who think differently than trained investigators, to review our unsolved cases. I'd like you to be part of it. I'm 12 years old. You're 12 years old and you solved what I couldn't solve in 15 years. Age doesn't determine capability. I learned that lesson the hardest possible way. Kellerman pulled out another document. This is a formal letter of apology from me, from the Philadelphia FBI field office, and from every agent who was in that conference room when we dismissed you. It's being entered into official records. We want what we did to you documented so future investigators remember what happens when you let prejudice override evidence. Tobias read the letter slowly. It was detailed, specific, unflinching in its acknowledgement of racist behavior. Why? He asked. Why what? Why apologize publicly? You could have just done this quietly, protected your reputation. Kellerman smiled sadly. Because protection is what caused this problem in the first place. People protecting their egos, their careers, their assumptions. Real change requires uncomfortable honesty. You taught me that. He stood to leave, then turned back. Tobias, you're going to get a lot of attention now. Universities will offer scholarships. Organizations will want you to speak. People will try to use your story for their own purposes. Through all of it, remember what you told that reporter in the park. What's that? Truth doesn't care about your age or your race. It only cares about evidence and courage. Kellerman's voice was thick with emotion. You had both when nobody else did. Don't let anyone take that away from you. 6 months after Thomas Brennan's arrest in Rittenhouse Square Park, his trial became the most watched criminal proceeding in Philadelphia's history. The evidence Tobias had compiled was so comprehensive, so meticulously documented, that Brennan's expensive defense team had nowhere to hide. HVAC permits proving access to Victoria's building, financial records showing payments from Vertex to Brennan's shell companies, testimony from his former business partner's widow about conversations discussing the researcher problem, Victoria's contamination research showing exactly why she'd been murdered, and at the center of it all, a 12-year-old boy who'd seen patterns trained investigators had missed. Tobias testified for 3 hours. The defense tried to discredit him, to suggest his research was amateur, his conclusions speculative. But then the prosecutor asked one simple question. Mr. Chen, Detective Kellerman worked this case for 15 years and found nothing. You worked it for 6 months and solved it completely. What did you do differently? Tobias thought carefully before answering. I didn't assume I knew what murder looked like. I didn't have biases about who could be a killer or what their motive might be. I just followed evidence without prejudgment. That's not a special skill, that's just being willing to see what's actually there instead of what you expect to be there. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Thomas Brennan was convicted on all counts. First-degree murder, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder, federal corruption charges, witness intimidation. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, Tobias sat in the gallery beside his mother and Detective Kellerman. Rachel Bennett sat on his other side, sobbing with relief that 15 years of waiting had finally ended. But the trial was just the beginning of the reckoning. Vertex Pharmaceuticals faced federal criminal charges for knowingly distributing contaminated medications. The company's CEO, CFO, and 3 other executives were arrested and prosecuted. Evidence showed they'd known about the contamination for 8 months before Victoria discovered it. They'd calculated that recalls would cost more than potential lawsuits, so they'd kept selling poisoned drugs to sick people who trusted them. The pharmaceutical industry faced new regulations requiring independent verification of manufacturing safety. The Victoria Bennett Protection Act passed Congress with bipartisan support, creating stronger whistleblower protections for researchers who exposed corporate malfeasance. Victims of the contaminated medications received settlements totaling $800 million. Families who'd lost loved ones to drugs that were supposed to heal them finally received acknowledgement that their deaths hadn't been inevitable complications, but preventable murders driven by corporate greed. 1 year after solving Victoria Bennett's murder, Detective Raymond Kellerman was promoted to head of Philadelphia PD's Cold Case Division. His first act was creating a youth advisory board of brilliant young researchers who could review cases with fresh eyes. Tobias was the first member appointed. He looked directly at Tobias. "This young man saved my career by destroying my pride. He taught me that justice isn't about credentials or authority. It's about courage and evidence. I'm grateful every day that he refused to stay silent when I tried to silence him." The Victoria Bennett Foundation was established to fund research into pharmaceutical safety. Rachel Bennett served as director, ensuring her sister's legacy would be protecting future whistleblowers and supporting researchers brave enough to expose dangerous truths. And Tobias? He went back to being a 7th grader who happened to also be one of the country's most accomplished cold case investigators. He still sat in library corners, surrounded by books, still worked problems that adults had given up on, still saw patterns others missed. But now, when he spoke, people listened. Not because he'd become famous, not because he'd proven himself by solving an impossible case, but because the world had learned, painfully, slowly, reluctantly, that brilliance doesn't care about your expectations. It shows up in 12-year-old kids with worn backpacks and oversized hoodies. It speaks truth even when authority figures throw its words in the trash. It refuses to be silent just because silence is safer. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to listen before it's too late, that brilliance will solve problems you'd given up on years ago. All you have to do is have the humility to hear it. 5 years later, Tobias Chen stood in front of 300 law enforcement professionals at the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. At 17, he was the youngest person ever invited to address the Academy's Criminal Justice Symposium. Behind him, projected on a massive screen, was the connection web that had started everything. Red, blue, green, and black strings connecting Victoria Bennett's photograph to evidence that had been invisible for 15 years. In the front row sat Detective Raymond Kellerman, now director of Philadelphia's Cold Case Division. Beside him, Dr. Sarah Chen, whose book on supporting brilliant children had transformed educational approaches nationwide. And Rachel Bennett, whose sister's murder had become a catalyst for change that saved countless lives. Tobias looked out at the assembled professionals. FBI agents, police detectives, federal prosecutors, U.S. Marshals, every face representing the system that had once dismissed him. 5 years ago, Tobias began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd earned respect through intelligence and courage, I was called ignorant by people who should have known better. The room was absolutely silent. I walked into an FBI conference room with 6 months of research, documentation that could have solved Victoria Bennett's 15-year-old murder, and I was laughed at, mocked. My evidence was thrown in the trash, not because it was weak, not because my conclusions were wrong, but because I was a 12-year-old black kid and powerful people had decided my voice didn't matter. He paused, letting that truth settle. Those agents made assumptions about my intelligence based on my age and my skin color. They saw a kid in a hoodie from a working-class neighborhood and decided I couldn't possibly have anything valuable to contribute. They dismissed me before I finished my first sentence. Tobias clicked to the next slide. Victoria Bennett's photograph filled the screen. That dismissal almost let a killer go free forever. It almost allowed systematic corruption to continue destroying justice. It almost prevented 47 murder victims from getting acknowledgement that their deaths were preventable crimes, not inevitable complications. Another slide. The HVAC permit that had been the first crucial connection. I solved Victoria's murder because I didn't have assumptions about what killers look like or what their motives might be. I followed evidence without prejudgment. But here's the truth that should terrify all of you. I almost didn't get the chance. Tobias looked directly at his audience. If Detective Kellerman hadn't eventually chosen truth over ego, if my mother hadn't been brave enough to call FBI Internal Affairs in Washington, if we hadn't created insurance policies that made us too dangerous to silence quietly, I would have been just another dismissed voice, another black kid whose warnings went unheard until it was too late. The weight of that reality filled the room. Every person here has dealt with cases that haunt you, victims who deserve justice, families who need answers, and somewhere out there right now there's someone who sees the pattern you've missed. They might be young. They might lack formal training. They might not look like what you expect a serious investigator to look like. He clicked to his final slide. One sentence in bold letters. Who else aren't you listening to? I challenge each of you to ask that question. Look at your unsolved cases with fresh eyes. Invite perspectives from people who think differently than you do. Create space for voices that don't sound like yours. Listen to the community members who've been trying to tell you things you haven't wanted to hear. Tobias's voice softened, but carried even more power. Justice requires humility. The humility to admit you might be wrong. The humility to listen to dismissed voices. The humility to value evidence over assumptions. After his speech, dozens of people wanted to shake Tobias's hand, share stories of cases they were reopening with new approaches, promise to listen better. The story of the ignorant kid who solved the FBI's most embarrassing cold case would be told for generations. Not just as an inspiring story, but as a fundamental challenge to anyone in power. Listen to the voices you want to dismiss. Look at the evidence you want to ignore. Question your assumptions before they become your blind spots. Because somewhere out there, someone you're about to call ignorant might be the genius who sees what you've been missing all along. And that person might be the only one who can bring justice to those who've been waiting in silence for someone, anyone, to finally hear the truth. Tobias pulled up his laptop and opened his current case file. A cold case from Baltimore, 8 years unsolved. Police had given up, but the victim's family never had. He started reading, connecting, analyzing. Because the work never stopped. The dismissed voices never stopped needing someone to listen. The victims never stopped deserving justice. And Tobias Chen, once called ignorant, once mocked in an FBI conference room, once told his voice didn't matter, would never stop fighting for truth. No matter how many times he had to prove that brilliance comes from unexpected places. No matter how many systems he had to challenge, no matter how many people he had to remind that justice doesn't care about your age or your race or your credentials. It only cares about evidence and courage. And Tobias had both in abundance. The truth doesn't care about your age, your credentials, or your authority. It only cares about who has the courage to speak it and who has the wisdom to listen. Tobias Chen, age 17. Drop a comment. What injustice in your community needs someone brave enough to challenge it? What system needs someone willing to speak truth to power? Subscribe so you never miss stories that prove ordinary people can challenge corrupt systems and win. Hit the notification bell so you're first to know when we drop the next story of someone who refused to stay silent. And remember, sometimes the smallest voice in the room is telling the biggest truth. The only question is whether you have the courage to listen.